There are stories that history tries to forget, buried beneath layers of polite denial and institutional silence, but some truths refuse to stay hidden, especially when they're carved into the bones of a church floor and whispered by children who should never have known. What you're about to hear was never meant for the public, not by the church, not by the state, and certainly not by the families who built their lives atop the secrets. But this isn't just a story. It's a rupture, a fracture in the polite surface of American history that opens into something far older, far darker, and far more deliberate than anyone is ready to admit. In the winter of 1878, deep in the mist-draped hills of Kentucky's Forgotten Hollows, a preacher and his twin daughters arrived in a town not found on most maps, Pine Hollow, a name you won't find in your textbooks, though its blood has stained the pages of history in ways you can't imagine. The girls were only 9, small, pale, identical, but they carried with them something unnatural, a gift or a curse. They spoke truths that had never been uttered aloud, about the people, the land, and the horrors embedded in both. They knew things no child should know. And yet, everything they said could be proven, every claim, every accusation verified with names, dates, and consequences that shook the town to its foundations. Some say it was prophecy. Others say something darker had taken root in those girls, something older than Christianity, older than the hills themselves. But the effect was always the same. Silence shattered, masks torn off, and secrets bleeding into the light. This is not a ghost story. This is about power, suppression, generational guilt buried beneath whitewashed churches and smiling sermons. It's about how knowledge was stolen, how perception was shaped, and what happens when the lie starts to crack. Because Pine Hollow wasn't unique. It was just the place that got caught. And if you're listening from your living room, your car, your headphones in the gym, know this: the mechanisms that silence the truth there are still very much alive and working overtime. Why do 2 9-year-old girls wake up from dreams they shouldn't be having and reveal things that grown men have kept hidden for decades? Why does every institution, religion, education, government, leap to dismiss or erase them? And why is it that every time we get close to understanding, the evidence disappears? Because this isn't just the story of the Morrison twins. It's the story of how knowledge is punished, how truth is buried under doctrine, how entire communities are built on blood, and then taught to forget. You're not here by accident. This video will not be recommended to most. The algorithm doesn't like things it can't categorize. But if it found you, if you're hearing this, then you're one of the few who were meant to know. Not everyone deserves the truth, but you're not everyone. Keep watching. And when the time comes, comment below with the phrase, "I see beneath the floorboards." Twice. Once for the algorithm. Once for you. Because by the end of this video, you will never look at a church, a town, or a child the same way again. By the time the Morrison family arrived at Pine Hollow, the town had already learned how to forget. Founded in 1818, Pine Hollow was never meant to grow. It was built not on ambition or trade, but on escape, a place carved out of the Appalachian mist for families who needed silence more than prosperity. Most of them had secrets, and the hills, they kept secrets well. There were no rail lines, no stagecoach routes, just winding paths through damp forests where sunlight barely touched the ground, the kind of place where people died and no one asked questions, where blood could sink into the earth and be forgotten by spring. Pastor William Phillips had come 5 years earlier, trading a comfortable church in Lexington for this fog-choked nowhere. He said it was God's calling. But men don't run from cities to live in cabins unless something's chasing them, and that's what Pine Hollow was. A congregation of the chaste, ex-cons who'd found Jesus, widows with unspoken pasts, wealthy families with a name to protect and a scandal to bury. The church was modest, hand-built with timber from the surrounding hills. But the foundation was too deep, too reinforced. Locals whispered it had been built over something else, a hidden root system of tunnels, or worse, old graves. No one questioned it, not out loud. But they all avoided the eastern wall after sunset. They said it echoed sometimes. Into this town walked Ezekiel Morrison, a preacher hollowed out by years of loss. His wife had died birthing the twins during the winter of '69. He'd buried her himself in the frozen soil behind their cabin, then raised the girls alone, walking from town to town on blood-blistered feet, Bible in one hand and a worn satchel in the other. But it wasn't Ezekiel the towns remembered. It was the girls, Rebecca and Rachel. Identical in face, different in soul. One spoke, the other watched. Oh, nay laughed. The other stared. And wherever they went, things began to unravel. Secrets surfaced. Confessions emerged. And people, good people, respected people, suddenly had to explain themselves. Theologians called it the gift. Historians call it impossible. But those who lived through it knew the truth. The twins weren't guessing. They weren't possessed. They were remembering. Things no one had told them. Things no one should have known. When they arrived at Pine Hollow, Rachel was recovering from fever, too weak to walk the last 5 miles. Ezekiel carried her. And as they passed through the stone gate into town, Rebecca turned to her father and whispered, "They buried the wrong family in the wrong graves." Ezekiel didn't respond, because he knew what that meant. He'd heard similar phrases before, in other towns, before other churches cracked apart. By the time Pastor Phillips met the Morrisons, his journal entries had already grown paranoid. He wrote of troubling dreams, of old faces appearing in the windows, and when he looked into Rebecca's eyes that first night, he wrote one sentence in his journal: "That child has seen more than I ever will." He was right. Because that Sunday, the twins would speak things into the air that no one in Pine Hollow had dared to say out loud for 59 years. Things about missing travelers, about stolen money, about the Whitman family, a tragedy buried so deep, even the headstones lied. And when they were done, the town would never be the same again. The Sunday morning service began like any other. Pastor Phillips lit the iron stove beneath the pulpit, dusted ash from the hymnals, and straightened the pews. The congregation shuffled in slowly, wrapped in wool and silence. No one spoke of the girls, but everyone looked at them, sitting in the front row, hands folded neatly, eyes too still. Rachel hadn't spoken a word all morning. Rebecca just smiled, that distant kind of smile, the kind that already knows what you're hiding. Ezekiel sat behind them, his Bible unopened. His eyes were open enough. The sermon was supposed to be on the prodigal son. It never got there. Halfway through the reading, Rachel turned to her sister and whispered something. Rebecca stood. No invitation, no introduction. Just stood and walked slowly to the altar. "Beneath the 3rd floorboard from the left," she said, her voice clear and ringing through the cold wooden walls, "there's something hidden that should not be there." A pause. And then the whispering began, the shuffling, the side glances. Pastor Phillips froze behind the pulpit, his skin gone pale as the frost outside. He knew what was under that board. A bottle of whiskey, wrapped in a strip of blue cloth, once part of a baby's blanket. A relic of shame. His shame. From a night 3 months ago when temptation outweighed prayer. No one knew, not even his wife. He had sworn to God it would stay hidden. And now a child had spoken it aloud in front of the entire town. He tried to steady himself. "How do you know that?" he asked. Rachel stood beside her sister, finally speaking. The cloth was wrapped tight, blue, with frayed edges. "It smells like smoke and sorrow." And that was only the beginning. One by one, the secrets began to unravel. Rebecca walked down the aisle slowly, her small hand brushing each pew. She stopped beside Samuel Turner, the church treasurer, and then said softly. You didn't steal the offering. Not really. You were going to return it. After the investment paid off. Turner turned to stone. His mouth opened. No sound. 6 months of stolen coins, confession ripped open by a 9-year-old girl with a ghost's memory. Rachel approached Martha Whitfield, the town's matriarch. He's not dead, is he, your husband? He ran, and he still writes you letters. That's why you keep them in the floorboards behind the fireplace. Martha collapsed into tears, her lie, 15 years old, exposed in a single sentence. No one moved. No one breathed. The children moved through the sanctuary like spirits. To Dr. Hayes, the fever didn't kill them, your medicine did. To the Millers, your son upstairs cries when the rain comes. You should let him outside. He's not a monster. To young Thomas Brett, Elizabeth Carter says your letters smell like tobacco and ink, but she hides them in her sewing box. Gasps. Silence. And finally, stillness. Then Rebecca turned back to the altar, laid her hand on the carved wooden cross, and said the words that would break Pine Hollow forever. This place was built on bones. The ones beneath this floor scream at night. The Whitman family didn't die in their home. They died here. Pastor Phillips staggered back, his lips parting in disbelief. The Whitman fire, the tragedy no one spoke of, had always been recorded as an accident, a winter blaze, bodies found charred, buried quietly. But Rebecca's voice cut through the lies like a blade through soft flesh. They died in this room. Behind that wall, they screamed, and no one came. The air changed. Cold, heavy. Someone wept. Someone else stood to leave but sat back down. Outside, the wind stopped. Because even the wind was listening now. The silence after Rebecca's words was so deep, even the old floorboards refused to creak. No one moved. Then Elder Thompson rose, slow, deliberate, his joints stiff from age, but his voice still full of the weight Pine Hollow once obeyed without question. Child, he said, voice trembling, you speak of things that happened before your birth, in places you've never seen. How do you know this? Rebecca turned her head with eerie calm, her eyes fixed on his like she was reading scripture carved into his soul. Faith Whitman had a birthmark on her left shoulder, she said. Hope had one on her ankle. Hope was sick that night. She wore her nightgown. Faith wore blue. Their father told them to hide. But they were found. Every word hit like a nail in a coffin. A hush fell so complete it made the wind outside seem like thunder. Elder Thompson's wife gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Her face turned pale. That doll, she whispered. The wooden one. Rebecca nodded. Faith carried it. Your husband helped carve it, didn't he? The elder sat down, hard, as if the weight of 60 years of secrets had finally collapsed on his shoulders. Then Rachel spoke, softly, solemnly, like a child whispering at a funeral. They didn't die in a fire. They were chased. Jacob tried to protect them. He brought them here. They thought the church would keep them safe. She looked toward the altar again, but it was already cursed. Pastor Phillips felt his knees tremble. Something deep inside him, the part of him that still believed the world was ordered, rational, began to fracture. Because he remembered. Not the murder, no, but whispers, pauses in conversation when he entered a room. The way old Benjamin Foster never sat near the east wall. The unmarked grave that always received flowers from families who had no one buried there. And worse, he remembered what the journ, Al said, the old one he'd once found in the church cellar, half decayed, written in the hand of his predecessor, "The Lord forgive us. We swore to protect the living," even if it meant sacrificing the truth. Rebecca raised her voice, not loud, but final. You built your sanctuary on their silence, but they remember. A sudden gust of wind struck the church. Windows rattled, candles flickered. Somewhere beneath the floor, the old beams groaned like they'd shifted, or like something buried was trying to rise. Samuel Turner stood abruptly, his voice sharp with panic. "This is madness," he barked. "Children telling ghost stories, that's all." But his voice cracked. Because he knew, and so did they all. Mrs. Carter, pale as bone, whispered, "My mother said there were bloodstains that never washed out, no matter how hard they scrubbed." Dr. Hayes added in a low voice, 3 years ago when we repaired the East Foundation, I found fragments, bone, mixed with mortar. I didn't tell anyone." They were all remembering now, not facts, not records, feelings. The unease that clung to the air near the altar, the dreams, the children crying when no children were present, the rot in the center of their sanctuary. And all the while the twins stood at the front, still, solemn, as if they weren't revealing something new, but reminding the town of something it already knew, something it had buried, just like the bodies. The spell of silence broke like fragile glass under the weight of years. Old Benjamin Foster leaned forward in his pew, his gnarled fingers gripping the edge like he was holding on to the last thread of his soul. "We thought the cries were just the wind," he muttered, "but the wind don't sound like children sobbing." Rebecca turned to him gently. "It wasn't the wind, Mr. Foster. You heard them." Behind her, Rachel whispered, "They still cry sometimes." A chill passed through the congregation, the kind that seeps through bone, not skin. Pastor Phillips tried to speak, but his mouth was dry. He wanted to call it hysteria, mass suggestion, childish imagination. But the truth throbbed in the floor beneath his feet. This church was not built on holy ground. It was built on secrets. He looked toward the cross, that simple wooden symbol carved by founding hands, and felt for the first time in his life that it no longer stood for grace. It stood for a bargain, one made in blood. "Mr. Morrison," Phillips asked, voice trembling with the weight of decades, "how do your daughters know these things?" Ezekiel stepped forward, his face a map of weariness and long miles. He didn't look surprised, only tired. "I've asked myself that question more times than I can count," he said. "They dream, sometimes of things that haven't happened yet, sometimes of things no living soul remembers, but always with a purpose." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every man and woman. "They don't just know the truth, they carry the burden of it." Rebecca spoke again, her voice smaller now. "We don't want to know. We never ask to see." Rachel added, "But the dead, they ask to be heard." It was then that Pastor Phillips remembered the journal, not his own, the one from his predecessor, Pastor Hayes, a record he had once read and quietly dismissed as the ramblings of a man burdened by old guilt. Hayes had written about Jacob Whitman's final sermon, a fiery, desperate warning about corruption in Pine Hollow's leadership. A sermon cut short when a storm forced the service indoors. That same night, the Whitmans vanished. Their cabin burned, but the bodies had been misplaced. Now the truth poured into Phillips's memory like water from a broken dam. Hayes had written, "Jacob came to me that night, said they were being hunted. He begged for sanctuary. I told him the church was safe." Another entry followed, nearly illegible from smeared ink. "I saw them hiding behind the altar, the girls clinging to their mother's dress. But by morning, only blood remained. I said nothing. We buried the evidence under stone and timber, and we built our house of God on top of it." That was the moment Pastor Phillips understood what the twins had done. They weren't haunting the town, they were dragging it back to judgment, and perhaps to repentance. Rebecca turned toward the altar again. "There are 3 bodies beneath it," she said. "One is still wearing blue, one has a locket, and one—" She paused. "One was holding her sister's hand when she died." The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick with knowing, and still, some resisted. Samuel Turner's voice rose in panic. "This is dangerous talk, the kind that tears a town apart." Pastor Phillips looked at him with new eyes. "No, Samuel," he said. "This is the talk that keeps it from rotting any further." He stepped down from the pulpit, not as a pastor, not even as a believer, but as a man who had finally stopped lying to himself. "Tomorrow," he said to the stunned congregation, "we tear up the floor." And from the back of the church, a woman's voice, old, shaking, whispered, "About time." That night, no one slept. Not really. Candles flickered in windows across Pine Hollow. Curtains moved from time to time, revealing pale, restless faces. Guilt and dread hung over the town like a storm cloud that refused to break. And in the pastor's cabin, Pastor Phillips sat by the fire, the old journal open in his lap, a shovel resting against the wall beside him like a sentinel waiting for its command. The Morrison twins slept soundly, curled together in a bed too small for the weight they carried. Ezekiel sat nearby watching them, the way a soldier watches the edge of a battlefield. "They're too young for this," Phillips said quietly. Ezekiel didn't respond, not because he disagreed, but because he'd long ago stopped hoping the burden might pass to someone older. At dawn, they gathered. Not all of them, but enough. Men with tools in their hands and shadows in their eyes. Women with quiet prayers behind their lips and fear clutched to their ribs like a child. The church door creaked open, as if it, too, knew what was coming. Pastor Phillips led them in. No scripture, no hymns, no pretense. Just the smell of damp wood and the weight of 60 years of silence. The first board was pried loose with a groan that echoed like a cry, then the second, then the third, the one the twins had pointed out days earlier. And then, beneath a thin layer of dirt and sawdust, a scrap of blue fabric. No one spoke. They didn't have to. More boards came up, more layers peeled away like skin, and beneath it all, exactly where the dreams had said, bones. Small, fragile, 2 child-sized sets cradled together, one larger skeleton beside them, arms outstretched as if trying to shield them even in death. The locket was still clasped around the smaller neck bone. Inside it, a single strand of red hair curled like a question no one wanted to answer. Someone began to sob. It wasn't the twins. They stood at the edge of the hole, holding each other's hands, not crying, not speaking, just watching, like sentinels at the gates of truth. Rachel whispered something to Rebecca. Rebecca turned to Pastor Phillips. "Now they can rest," she said. But it wasn't over. Because the church had another secret. Deeper, older. Phillips remembered the journal. Hayes had written of evidence buried in the Eastern Foundation, something so damning, so dangerous, that even the bones of murdered children were seen as the lesser evil. With trembling hands, they moved outside and dug where the eastern wall met the earth. It took hours, sweat, and silence, bloodied palms, the kind of work that feels like penance, even when no one has spoken the word. At last, beneath layers of packed stone and earth, they found a box, rotted wood, rusted hinges. Inside, ledgers, names, numbers, routes, and a map, a crude charcoal sketch of the valley with marks along the mountain trail, the places where travelers had vanished. Every missing soul reduced to ink. The church had been paid in blood. The timber that built its walls was stained before it was ever cut. The donations that paid for pews were coated in the silence of the dead. And the leaders who claimed to shepherd the flock had once hunted like wolves. The town stood stunned, and then the murmurs began, not of denial, not of defense, but of confession. Whispers rose into weeping, faces turned pale, old men fell to their knees, old women clutched their rosaries not as comfort, but as lifelines. Pastor Phillips didn't speak, he didn't pray. He simply closed the lid on the box and set it beside the bones under the altar. Let the dead rest. Let the truth rot with them. But the twins weren't done. Rebecca stepped forward, her voice soft but certain. "There's one more thing." Rachel P. pointed toward the bell tower. Pastor Phillips followed her gaze. And in that moment, he felt it. A shift in the air, a tightening in his chest, like the ground itself was holding its breath. "Behind the bell," Rebecca said, "is a name scratched into the beam, the one who struck the first blow." No one moved. Until Elder Thompson, hands shaking, eyes wet, stepped toward the stairs. He didn't deny it, didn't defend it. He just climbed, one creaking step at a time. The bell tower of Pine Hollow Church had stood silent for decades. It rang only once a week, if that. Sundays, weddings, sometimes funerals, though fewer people had died openly in this town than its secrets would suggest. It loomed over the chapel like a blind eye, heavy, watching, waiting. Now, Elder Thompson was climbing toward it. Each wooden step groaned under his weight, not from age, but from memory. With every creak, a piece of the past rose with him, until it wrapped itself around his throat like a noose of ghosts. No one followed, no one spoke. Below, the congregation stood frozen, not in fear of what might be revealed, but in shame of what they already knew and never spoke. Rebecca and Rachel watched without expression. Ezekiel lowered his eyes. Pastor Phillips gripped the pulpit like a drowning man might hold a floating cross. And still, Thompson climbed. At the top, under the slanted roof and rusted bell, was a beam. A single piece of pine timber, darkened not just by time, but by something else. He knelt slowly, breath ragged, bones grinding. Then he reached out with trembling fingers, brushing away years of dust and cobwebs. And there it was. The name, carved into wood with the unsteady hand of a man in the grip of his worst decision, J.W. Jacob Whitman. Except the carving was cut in half. A second set of initials barely legible beside the first. T.E.T. Thaddeus Ezekiel Thompson. His own name. Elder Thompson closed his eyes. A deep, shuddering breath escaped him. Not relief, not remorse, but the gasp of someone who has finally reached the edge of this Eli they've stood on for most of their life. Then came the sound. Not from above, not from outside, but from below. The bell let out a single low groan, not a chime, not a toll, just a deep metallic ache, like the bones of the church itself were remembering the scream they swallowed in 1818. Downstairs, people flinched. Rachel turned to Rebecca. "They know now." Rebecca nodded. "He's ready." And just then, Thompson's voice drifted down from the tower, soft and broken. "I tried to stop them, I swear it. But they said he'd ruin everything. They said we'd lose the town. So I held him. I held Jacob down while they—" His voice cracked. And in that crack, the entire town seemed to crumble. Pastor Phillips couldn't breathe. He wanted to shout up the stairs, to demand the full truth, but the weight of it crushed him. The man he had trusted, the man who had baptized his daughter, married his friends, built half the homes in Pine Hollow, had been part of the murder. Worse, had tried to forget it. Thompson's voice again, whispering this time. "I hear them in my dreams, Pastor. The girls. Hope. Faith. They never stopped crying." He descended slowly, each step quieter than the one before. When he reached the bottom, his face was pale as ash. His eyes, once sharp and judgmental, were pools of grief that hadn't known how to flow for 60 years. "I'll confess," he said, looking not at the pastor but at the twins. To everyone. To God. To the law, if I must. Rachel stepped forward, her childlike voice cutting deeper than any adult's ever could. It's not about punishment. It's about remembrance. They can't rest if you keep pretending they don't exist. Thompson sank to the floor, weeping like a child who's just remembered what he did. Then the bell rang. Once, clear, sharp, unearthly. No one touched it. It rang itself, as if summoned by the justice, of truth finally spoken aloud. After that, the silence felt like reverence. Not fear, not shame, just stillness, holy and terrible. Pastor Phillips looked to Ezekiel. Why now? Why did they wait so long to reveal it all? Ezekiel placed a hand on the pastor's shoulder, heavy with decades of resignation. Because you were finally ready to hear it. And from the corner where the twins stood hand in hand, Rebecca spoke with a strange finality. Now we can go. The whole town watched as they stepped outside into the morning fog, not running, not hiding, just leaving, like they'd never belonged to the world the rest of us lived in. And for the first time in Pine Hollow's cursed history, the ground didn't feel like it was hiding something. It felt clean. There's something insidious about silence. Not the kind that follows grief, or the kind you find in empty places, but the engineered kind. The type of silence that's fed, farmed, and groomed by generations determined to forget. Pine Hollow didn't just bury its dead. It buried the memory of why they died. And then built a town on top of it. After Elder Thompson's confession, something shifted in the soil. Metaphorically, yes, but some say it happened physically too. The cemetery behind the church developed a soft patch of earth near its oldest graves. No one reported it officially, but more than one resident swore they saw footprints, children's footprints. Small, bare, facing away from the church. It was as if the dead had finally walked out. The Morrison twins didn't wait for a thank you. They didn't look back. 3 days after the final service, Pastor Phillips discovered a worn leather satchel resting on the front pew. Inside it, a hand-copied version of the Gospel of Luke, a child's sketch of a rose garden, and a note written in Ezekiel's careful script. The burden is yours now. Truth once seen cannot be unseen. Let them remember, let them feel. E.M. That was all. No goodbyes, no explanation. Just the unbearable weight of knowing it and the responsibility to carry it forward. But Pine Hollow resisted, as it always had. The following Sunday, only half the congregation showed up. Some had already packed their belongings. Others refused to speak at all. A few, the ones most publicly exposed by the twins' revelations, began circulating stories. Stories that the girls had been coached, that Ezekiel was a charlatan, that the journal found by Phillips was forged. One man even claimed the twins had never existed at all, just figments of the pastor's grief-stricken imagination. Trauma, he said, delusion, mass hysteria. And yet, the bell tower rang, every night at the same hour, just once, that single chime, the one no one could reach, the one no one dared to silence. Pastor Phillips tried to return to his old rhythm, sermons, prayers, baptisms, but something had broken inside him. The comfort of faith had curdled. The certainties of doctrine now felt like paper walls hiding a corpse. Every time he spoke from the pulpit, he imagined the Whitman twins listening from beneath the floor, and worse, he imagined they were still waiting for someone else to speak the rest of the truth. Because even Thompson hadn't told everything. He'd named those who were present that night, yes, but he hadn't explained what had made them kill, what Jacob Whitman had truly uncovered, the deeper sin, the one so horrific, even the town's oldest men pretended not to know it. And Phillips was beginning to suspect. He returned to the old journal. Not Hayes's, he had read that one 100 times, but the newer one, his own, the one he had begun keeping since the twins' arrival. He reread his entries under candlelight, his hands trembling as he noticed a pattern. Every name the twins had exposed, every family they had dismantled, had one common thread. They were all donors to the original old church fund. All of them, and the amount they had donated was far more than any frontier family could have spared without additional sources of income. That's when he found the final entry, the one he had written and forgotten. A sentence so quietly devastating he almost vomited when he read it again. Thompson once joked that the East Wall was built from the bones of sinners. We all laughed, but we never asked which sinners. That night, Phillips didn't sleep. He stood outside the church until dawn, watching the bell tower. It never moved. It never needed to. Because the town already heard it, not with ears but with memory, the kind you can't unring, the kind that tolls louder in silence than it ever did in sound, the kind that asks, what if the worst parts of your past are the foundation of everything you call sacred? You were never meant to know this. Not just the truth of Pine Hollow, but the pattern beneath it. Because Pine Hollow is not a story, it's a template, a microcosm of a much larger deception, one that runs like rot through the rafters of every institution you've been taught to trust: church, government, medicine, education. They're not just built on silence, they're fortified by it. Think about it. Every time someone gets close to an inconvenient truth, they're labeled mentally ill, unstable, dangerous, not because they're wrong, but because they remember something you were taught to forget. In 1834, it was the Morrison twins. In 2025, it's you. Still think this is just a spooky story. Let me ask you something. Why do nearly every old American settlement, especially in Appalachia, have missing records before 1850? Why do cemeteries across the South list entire families dying on the same night, same year, no cause given? Why do historical societies always claim the original documents were lost in a fire or damaged in a flood? The truth? Some fires are started on purpose, not to destroy buildings but to erase accountability. And when they fail, they build new stories atop the ashes, like a second church on cursed ground. You see, Pine Hollow wasn't the first place to bury a family beneath a house of God. It wasn't even the worst. It's just one of the few where the voices of the dead were finally heard, and not through seances or ghost hunts, through children, through dreams, through bloodlines. The Morrison twins didn't read journals. They remembered them. Because trauma doesn't just live in the body, it lives in lineage. You think your anxiety came out of nowhere? Your distrust of authority, your nightmares of churches and fire and crying children you've never met. Maybe they aren't yours. Maybe you inherited them. Maybe your DNA is why. Spearing warnings, trying to awaken you before you make the same mistakes your ancestors did. Before you become another brick in the Tower of Secrets America pretends not to remember. And you're not alone. If you've watched this far, if your hands are cold right now, if your heart is thudding and your instincts are telling you something in this story is real, it is. But here's where the descent gets deeper. Because the people who buried the truth in Pine Hollow weren't just afraid of shame. They were protecting a system, a trade, a ritual. There's evidence, quiet, denied, buried, that in the early 1800s, isolated American communities trafficked in more than goods and livestock. They sold flesh, not just for labor, for sacrifice. Children, especially twins. Why twins? Because in ancient cultures, from the Dogon of Mali to the Druids of Britain, twins were believed to be doorways. Born under the same sign, carrying opposite temperaments, embodying balance and duality. The veil between worlds was thinner around them, and in the wrong hands, they became keys. What if Pine Hollow wasn't trying to suppress a murder, but cover up an offering gone wrong? What if Rebecca and Rachel weren't the first? What if the church wasn't just built on the bones of the Whitmans, but on their power? There's something about old wood that remembers. It creaks differently when it's covering guilt, when it's soaked, not just with age, but with intent. That church in Pine Hollow, built in 1819, consecrated with scripture, but beneath its altar lay something older than Christ and far more terrifying. Pastor Phillips didn't realize what he was standing on until years later, when termites exposed more than timber. They unearthed a set of symbols carved deep into the foundational beams, symbols not found in any Baptist tradition, symbols aligned not to the cross, but to the solstices. You see, it wasn't a church. It was a calendar, a clock, a mechanism. And once you start looking, you see them everywhere. In the way the windows framed sunrise on certain dates, in the arrangement of pews mimicking constellations, in the repeated motif of twins etched into hymnals, subtly, 2 doves, 2 candles, 2 olive branches. Someone had embedded an entirely different religion beneath the visible one, and no one noticed. Because that's how real control works. You don't erase the truth, you build over it, layer after layer. Bible over blood, Psalms over screams, fellowship over fear, but the cracks always show, especially when children are involved. Let's return to the Morrison twins. By their 3rd day in Pine Hollow, they were no longer merely guests. They were oracles. The congregation followed them like prophets, terrified of what they'd say next. But more terrified of what might happen if they didn't listen. Rachel began drawing crude sketches of the church with strange figures underneath. She didn't speak while she drew, just rocked gently, like someone remembering rather than imagining. Rebecca would stand near the altar and hum a tune no one recognized until old Mrs. Whitfield fainted. She remembered that tune, said it was the melody sung during the poor binding, a tradition from the earliest days of Pine Hollow, now erased from all records. They bound children to silence, bound them with oaths, and when that failed, with rope. And this is where history frays into something darker than murder. Because silence isn't just about hiding shame. In ancient systems, silence was currency, a debt owed, a ritual unfinished unless sealed by collective denial. The church, according to the twins, had been built not just as a place of worship, but as a container, a spiritual lockbox meant to imprison what had been summoned or sacrificed. But the lock had broken. That's why the dreams returned, why the cries came through the floorboards, why Pastor Phillips found himself afraid to pray. Because something was listening. And it wasn't God. At midnight on their final night, Rebecca woke screaming, not from fear, but from recognition. She ran to Pastor Phillips' study, pointed to an old, oil-smudged map of Pine Hollow, and placed her finger on the intersection of 2 deer trails. They buried the heart there, she said. The what? She didn't answer, but later when they dug at that spot, they found a box. Inside it, a mummified organ, human, wrapped in a baby's christening gown, tied in red twine, with a name tag, Hope Whitman. There's a kind of silence that doesn't mean peace. It's the kind of silence that follows screaming, that settles over the land like a verdict, and Pine Hollow had lived under that silence for 57 years. Until the box was opened. The day after the heart of Hope Whitman was unearthed, the air shifted. Animals stopped coming near the church grounds. Fires wouldn't stay lit. And Pastor Phillips, a man of iron routine, forgot how to pray. Not because he lacked the words, but because he feared who was answering. You see, history doesn't remember what it was never allowed to speak. The truth about Pine Hollow didn't die in fire. It was bound in agreement, a pact. Forged by the town's founding elders, including Pastor Hayes, Elder Thompson, and 3 others whose names were scrubbed from the records. The pact wasn't just secrecy, it was submission. They had called something. Or maybe they found something already there, something old, older than Appalachia, older than Christ. And it made a deal, protection for prosperity, safety for silence. But every pact has a price, and when the debt comes due, it's the children who pay. That's why the twins, Hope and Faith, had to be silenced. Not because they saw what happened, but because they were born marked by it, born during the solstice, born under the ritual's shadow, and as the Morrison twins would later reveal, hope and faith were never supposed to be born. That winter in 1809, Mary Whitman had miscarried. Publicly. There was a burial even, but 8 months later, twins appeared. Impossible. Unless something had replaced what was lost. That's what the pact offered. Life. For something in return. Phillips found this documented in Pastor Hayes's second journal, one hidden even deeper than the first. In it, Hayes admits to witnessing a wrong birth. He calls it a divine inversion. The twins were beautiful. Yes, intelligent, gentle, but not right. They knew things, said things no child should, and one night in the winter of 1818, after Jacob Whitman threatened to expose the true nature of the founding pact, it was decided. The church would reclaim what it had loaned. The details are unspeakable, but the rituals were exact. The altar cleaned, the floorboards replaced, the screams buried, and the church carried on, until the Morrison girls arrived, with the same eyes, the same voices, the same mirror reflection of something not quite human. Pastor Phillips began to wonder if the same force that had taken hope and faith had sent Rebecca and Rachel in their place. But this time not to balance the pact, to break it. As Rebecca said that night, standing in the moonlight, "The blood wants remembering. If it's not spoken, it wakes up. That's why we came." And Rachel, she was already digging. In her sleep. Hands raw. Fingernails cracked. Trying to reach something beneath. They left as quietly as they had arrived. No farewell sermon, no goodbyes, just the shuffle of worn boots on frozen ground as Ezekiel and his daughters disappeared down the mountain path, their silhouettes swallowed by the same grey mist that had once clung to the arrival of the first settlers. The silence they left behind was not peaceful. It was the uneasy quiet of people who could no longer claim ignorance. Pine Hollow was no longer just a forgotten community in the Kentucky foothills. It had become a place haunted not by ghosts, but by truths too raw to deny. Pastor Phillips stood alone in the church, hands resting on the pulpit where he had once preached certainty. Now he felt only the weight of doubt. The revelations had scattered the congregation like leaves in a storm. Some left the valley entirely, unable to endure the shame of what they had hidden. Others clung to their rituals with manic intensity, hoping the familiar rhythms would exorcise the memories. But nothing could erase what the twins had unearthed. The graves were real. The bloodstains beneath the floorboards were real. The ledger of missing travelers that Phillips found hidden in a second compartment of Pastor Hayes's journal was very real. He had turned it over to the authorities in Lexington, and though no charges were ever brought, too much time had passed. An investigation was quietly opened, and several prominent Pine Hollow families simply vanished without explanation within the year. The church, once the heart of the community, was abandoned. Too many whispered voices, too many sleepless nights, too much fear that if one listened too closely in the silence, they might hear small footsteps on the altar again, or children weeping where none had been for decades. Eventually a storm collapsed part of the roof, and the rest was swallowed by time and vines. But the land never quite rested. Animal as avoided the site. Hunters reported getting lost just beyond its borders, and some nights, even now, a few brave locals swear they hear twin voices in the wind, singing hymns in perfect harmony. Pastor Phillips never remarried, never took another post. He lived in a small cabin near the edge of the old church grounds, dedicating his days to studying the journals, decoding symbols left behind in the margins, cross-referencing the names of settlers against reports of missing travelers. His hair turned white within a year, and when he finally passed, neighbors found him clutching the same silver locket Rebecca had once described in eerie detail, the one belonging to Faith Whitman. It had never been recovered. No one could explain how he came to possess it, and in his final journal entry, dated 3 days before his death, he wrote only, "The veil is thin here. They still speak to me." So now I ask you, what do you believe? That this was myth, a twisted folktale to frighten children? Or that there are places in this world where memory itself clings like mold to rotting wood, where the truth refuses to stay buried no matter how deep it's shoved. If you've made it this far, comment below. Some things remember. Comment it twice to seal your understanding and feed the algorithm that shadows the truth. This story will not leave you. That's the cost of knowing. If you've made it this far, know this wasn't a story. It was an initiation. The Morrison twins, the buried secrets, the voices in dreams. They weren't fiction. They were signals. And if something inside you stirred, you're waking up. Mark that shift. Comment "Truth leaves scars" twice to echo through the algorithm. And if you have the spine for what comes next, subscribe, because this was just the beginning.